Every year, December rolls around and it comes with a buzz. Festive shopping, city lights, celebrations for the year wrapping up, and Santa Claus showing his face all over the place to really let you know that it's that time of year where you gotta be spending your money. Christmas time is as unique as it gets. Originally the second most important holiday in Christianity, it's evolved to become more of a social and cultural event over the last century. The season has created an entire industry around it, and it could even be said that it impacts the way that the entire economy functions all year round in a lot of the Western world. With the West becoming ever more secular and religion starting to play a smaller and smaller piece in people's everyday lives, it's easy to forget that religion has played a fundamental role in establishing culture and customs over centuries. Images of Santa Claus are synonymous with the festive season, which is a looser term that anyone can buy into regardless of their religion or beliefs. I appreciate that not everyone will celebrate the date itself for its significance, even within the Western world. But as we'll go into, it's an event that stands for a lot more than its religious significance. And I would argue that it's a general net positive for society, even if its impacts aren't black and white for everyone to see. In this video, we'll briefly cover the significance of the date itself and the phenomenon that is Santa Claus, before diving deep into the business and the economics of the Christmas industry, and considering both the positive and the negative impacts it has on society. Christmas is by no means a tradition without its critics, and we'll also cover some of the criticisms that people level towards it to be able to paint a fuller picture of the impact it has. As much as Christmas is now a cultural phenomenon that is celebrated around the world, it's important to be able to recognize its origins as a religious holiday and look at it through that lens to be able to understand how it took its current shape. As we started off by saying, Christmas is a traditional Christian celebration, but it's also not the most important one of the year, with Easter celebrating Jesus' resurrection being the central day in the calendar. There's no actual date in the Bible to say when Jesus was born. It was only in the 4th century, some 300 years after his death, that the occasion started to be celebrated. Depending on where you read, some people will say that it got its date because there was a pagan holiday that would celebrate it around the same time, and that would make it easier for people to buy in, as the Roman Empire was looking to convert more of its citizens onto Christianity. Others say that Jesus was conceived and died on the same day, which explains why Christmas is about 9 months after Easter. Regardless of why the date was picked, the celebration spread across the world as the religion spread over the centuries. As the European states that succeeded the Roman Empire also adopted Christianity and later spread it across the world, it's a tradition that is now celebrated from Alaska to Australia and from Patagonia to the Arctic Circle. The 25th of December and the eve of the 24th are the dates where most of the Western world celebrates the occasion, traditionally held with big meals and the exchanging of gifts. In some parts of the world and in some denominations of Christianity, the actual gift-giving and celebrations are saved until early in the new year, usually on the eve of the 6th and the day of the 7th of January. The celebrations in the end of December are related to the birth of Jesus, whereas the celebrations early in the new year in January are usually related to the wise men who brought gifts to baby Jesus. The act of giving gifts is a central part of the occasion. It took on many different forms over the centuries in different parts of the world, but the act itself is primarily related to the wise men who brought the gifts for Jesus once he was born. Today, gift-giving is the thing that Christmas is most synonymous with, and more than Jesus or the wise men who brought him gifts, the symbol that characterizes this internationally is that of Santa Claus. When people think of Christmas, or at least when Christmas starts to be advertised in cities all around the world, it has a face that is recognizable to pretty much everyone in the shape of the old man with the red hat and the white beard. Riding in his flying sleigh pulled by reindeers with elves that help him bring gifts to people around the world, Santa is the perfect example of how religion and culture became intertwined over the centuries. The modern figure of Santa is based on the European folklore tradition of Saint Nicholas of Myra, who was the patron saint of children, as well as Father Christmas, whose roots lay in England as far back as the 1400s. His image is directly associated with Christmas like no other, and over the last 150 years, he's really become the symbol of Christmas culture and an icon that is recognizable around the world, even in countries that don't celebrate the occasion. It's with Santa that we can really start to explore the economic and cultural myths around Christmas, starting with his origin story. I'm sure it was the same for a lot of people, but growing up, I was told that Santa was a marketing play made by Coca-Cola to sell more of their products. Or at least that Santa Claus used to wear green but only started wearing red because those were the colors of Coca-Cola and they wanted to associate him with their branding. It turns out that wasn't exactly true though, and Santa Claus was painted red years before Coke was even properly established as a company. And they didn't start to use Santa within their Christmas advertising until 1930. They did play a big role in spreading his image and making him become more of a cultural icon, not just in Europe and North America, but eventually across the world. Throughout the 20th century and even to this day, the US has been able to project culture and customs through Hollywood, mega corporations, and big budget advertising campaigns more than any individual country has been able to in all of history. Santa consistently appeared with bottles of Coke for most of the mid-20th century, and their images are definitely linked. But they also were very much not the only ones, as other companies, including Pepsi, have also used his image, and they certainly weren't the ones who made Santa wear red. More than anything though, Santa is a symbol not so much for the religious side of what Christmas was intended to be, but more so for the act of gift giving, as he brings presents to everyone from his house in the North Pole. Gift giving can have a lot of connotations for people, being a form of expressing gratitude, showing love, or showing people you care. Equally, the buying of the gifts themselves can also be, consciously or subconsciously, a representation of consumerism, which is a great little segue for us to start exploring the Christmas industry itself. Christmas is a phenomenon that is so hard to actually calculate and determine the impact of for two main reasons. Firstly, it happens every year, with no years off, which means that it's impossible to calculate its impact in a vacuum, or to have studies that would indicate how the economy would behave without it. Equally important is the fact that it impacts pretty much every single industry, but not in ways that are equally distributed among them, nor in ways that are consistent in different years. For example, if there's a new PlayStation or Xbox one year, you could find that people were buying those up heavily as Christmas presents for the next couple of years as long as they're in stock. Yet, once they've been out for a while, you won't see that same peak until a new one releases eventually. You'd imagine that some classic Christmas presents like socks, underwear, and deodorant probably won't have that much fluctuation in sales year on year, aside from the natural increase that most industries tend to have over time. But things like electronics may fluctuate a lot more depending on new releases and trends at the time. In terms of spending by the public, it's been calculated that in the US, a quarter of all personal spending for the entire year takes place during the Christmas festive season. The day of Black Friday tends to be known as the official opening of the floodgates for Christmas season spending. Companies drop their prices for a week or so to capitalize on the fact that people are out there looking for deals. With 1/4 of all personal spending for the year coming within a 6-week period, you can start to see why Q4 tends to be the biggest quarter for consumer-facing companies, as well as how this is a phenomenon that is already embedded in society. Aside from the presents that people buy for each other and for themselves, Christmas literally creates an entire industry and ecosystem around the occasion. Christmas home decorations and lights are something that we can point at and really see the impact of more clearly. Some sources claim that the size of that market is at $7 billion yearly worldwide, covering artificial decorations, Christmas lights, and Christmas trees around the world, projecting a growth of the industry to more than $10 billion by 2030. That is a huge sum to get houses looking pretty. And we're just looking at people's houses here. On the public sector, when it comes to government spending, Christmas city decorations around the world in all kinds of shapes and sizes will create several different transactions, with the government or city council paying for the lights themselves, the people to put them up, the electricity to keep them on, as well as all of the props they use for things like Christmas trees and ornaments. Also think about other Christmas-specific things that wouldn't be included in that list, but also wouldn't be large enough to create their own industry in and of themselves. Cards, gift wraps, shopping mall exhibitions, hiring people to be Santa to give the actual presents, those are just icing on the cake. Think about the farmers who have to plant Christmas trees that take almost a decade to grow, who have to predict demand 10 years from now for their products, not knowing if they're going to be able to make any sales as more and more people start switching to artificial trees. We don't even have to go looking for physical decorations though. Just think about Christmas music. The New York Post reported in 2021 that Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas, for example, an absolute classic at this point, makes over $3 million a year every single year from royalties. That song was first released in 1994, and it continues to top the charts every single year. And there's even that meme that shows up every time December comes around of the search term for her name starting to pick up steam. That's 3 million going to one song alone. And the thing with Christmas songs is that there don't tend to be that many new ones every year. They're etched in culture at this point. And even though every few years there's a new one that comes around, the artists who struck gold are still making a lot from it every time December rolls around. Alongside music, there's also a whole industry for Christmas movies, which can do very well while they're in the cinema, but also become classics that people can turn to every time December comes back around. Home Alone, The Grinch, Love Actually, and The Polar Express all made hundreds of millions in the box office, and continue to receive royalties as they're played on TV for years after. Food and drinks companies, hair and beauty salons, pubs and clubs, stores and companies that sell clothing, merchandise and card shops, toy stores, and many independent retailers will tend to have their biggest month of the year in December. Traditional services to fix up things around the house will also tend to have their biggest weeks within this period. Beyond that, charities and general donations to causes tend to peak around December time too. Some studies have found that around 31% of donations for the whole year tend to come in December, with around 13% coming in the last 3 days of the year alone. Some specialist businesses see all their sales come in this time, whereas many others will see their sales surge regardless. As much as economic activity tends to pick up in December regardless of the year, this isn't universally seen as a good thing, and there are some of those who align with the Grinch and don't think that the good of Christmas outweighs the bad, and they have some good reasons for that too. In 2015, Professor David Kyle Johnson wrote a book titled The Myths That Stole Christmas, where he argues that Christmas isn't actually good for the economy, and it simply just creates wasteful practices. One of his arguments is that the money being spent during the Christmas season would have been spent by people throughout the year anyway, and that this is just a way of concentrating their spending in a single period. Additionally, he also brings up the concept of deadweight loss, which essentially refers to the difference between the price being spent on a gift for someone and the perceived value that the recipient holds for it. He argues that just the difference between those two values and where the spending tends to be concentrated on non-essential items would be enough to make a significant difference in more essential sectors like infrastructure, healthcare, and education. His third argument against it, which I find the most sound, is that people go into debt to finance Christmas shopping. He claims that 2/3 of all Christmas spending is done on credit cards, which will prop up the economy but will ultimately harm the individual, essentially spending money they don't have to buy gifts for other people who won't even necessarily value it as highly. Even though buying things on a credit card doesn't necessarily mean that one doesn't have the money to actually spend on it, going into debt to finance Christmas presents isn't particularly great. Pope Francis also once made a speech where he prayed that humanity be freed from its slavery to material items. That is a whole aspect to get into, and how the focus of a holiday that was meant to be about celebration, gratitude, and the acknowledgement of the life of Jesus turned into more of a money-making and material consumption vehicle than anything else. At that point, I think you just have to ask yourself if Christmas being the way that it is today is the cause of those problems, or if it's just a symptom of how wider society operates. Materialism is front and central of people's lives, regardless of what the big Santa on the billboard is telling people they should be buying. There's a famous saying that goes, "We buy things we don't need, with money we don't have, to impress people we don't like." And if there is to be a proper critique of Christmas, I think that's it. At the same time though, how much of that is actually a critique of Christmas and not just a reflection of society and the way things are going, regardless of the event or the occasion being celebrated? Of the points that Professor Johnson brought up, the one that really stands out to me is the concept of deadweight loss, as in the difference between the actual cost of something versus the perceived value that the person getting it actually has for it. I do believe that gap is quite large, and if you were to project that across an entire population, you would probably end up with an enormous number. At the same time though, it's a theoretical concept more than anything. If you don't know that a shirt I gave you costs $50 and you value it at $20, for example, how do you solve that? Should I know to give you a $20 shirt instead? Would you then possibly value it at $10? Is the goal to minimize that gap? What about the kid that absolutely loved the $20 toy you gave them? Do they perceive that to be worth $20? What if in their mind it's worth thousands of dollars for the first couple of days because they love it and they play with it all the time? But what if in 6 months' time it's sitting on the shelf collecting dust because they've forgotten about it? How do you prescribe a perceived value to that? Should the solution be that Christmas is wasteful and we should all just pay more money in taxes so that the government can decide where to allocate it best? I'm not saying the concept of Christmas is without its flaws. I just don't see a solution to the problems it poses. The main causes of these problems seem to be rooted in the deeper societal issues of materialism and consumerism, possibly exacerbated by a general lack of gratitude among people. Despite the drawbacks, of which we can point some out for sure, to suggest that we should scrap Christmas as if it was an ornament on a tree that we can just take off and put back in a box seems to ignore the fact that societies and cultures have been built up as they have for thousands of years. It's literally impossible to accurately calculate the impact of Christmas versus no Christmas on society because there is no single data point for not having Christmas, and never mind one for people not even planning for it ahead of time. If a quarter of all personal spending in the US is done over the festive Christmas period, and some people go into debt during the festive season, you can't logically conclude that they would either spend the same amount throughout the year and still go into debt, or say that they wouldn't go into debt if it weren't for Christmas. There is no evidence to back either of those claims. Christmas is meant to be a time of celebration. Don't dig yourself into a hole for it. Clearly, people's perception of you doing so won't even be that great. So, to wrap it up then, what is it that the economics of Christmas involves, and how does it fit within society today? We started off by seeing how this once religious holiday has become a part of culture and tradition more than a celebration of the birth of Jesus per se. Religion, and Christianity specifically, played a fundamental role in building up and establishing Western culture over the centuries, and the two are very hard to unlink at this point. Over the last 100 years or so though, we saw how the symbolic image of Christmas shifted from being about the birth of Jesus to being Santa Claus, covering his origins as well as everything he represents to society today. To be able to actually assess the business and economics of Christmas, we looked into how that's an almost impossible task to do, since we don't have a reference point for what these countries that celebrate it would look like if they didn't have Christmas, and see the different industries that are actually impacted by it. Having said that, we explored how December tends to be the biggest month for companies in multiple different industries, and how Q4 tends to be the biggest quarter of the year for multiple different companies. Whole industries are created around the occasion, like those for decorations, merchandise, trees, and seasonal products specific to it. Not to mention the decorations that go up in cities, shopping malls, and different venues across the world. The Christmas industry is massive in and of itself, and the impact that the occasion has on pretty much every other industry in the economy is also huge. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't go without its critics. For all the drawbacks that we covered, ultimately it's an impossible task to accurately measure the potential negative impact it has on society, aside from some theoretical concepts that are important to consider. To look at the full impact of Christmas though, you need to look at it as a full package, beyond just the industries it creates, those that it props up, and the potential wastes that may come as a result of it. I see it as a time to be grateful, surrounded by family and friends that I appreciate, and alongside the fact that it's towards the end of the year and a good time to reflect, it's an occasion that I always look forward to. Whether you celebrate Christmas for its religious significance, or as a social and cultural occasion, or even if you don't celebrate it at all, I hope you have at least one day each year that you can set aside to dedicate to that purpose. Most cultures tend to have their particular day, whether it's religious or specific to the country. And regardless of the impact on the economy or the non-essential industries it may prop up, I feel like the good outweighs any of the potential negatives that come with it. Is it annoying to have to buy a bunch of presents and feel obliged to give certain people presents? Yes. Is it common that people will value what you gave them much less than what you actually spent on it? Yeah. Does the whole Christmas industry revolve around senseless spending and milking customers for as much of their money on as many different things as possible? Probably. Is it a shame that we're in an era where everything is material and the presents you're giving are often seen as more important than the actual occasion being celebrated? Definitely. Ultimately though, regardless of the negatives, the upsides that it brings and what it represents are generally positive for society. Enjoy the occasion, don't get into debt buying presents for people, and use the time in a way that will bring you good through reflection, gratitude, and sending good vibes to people. I hope you enjoyed, learned something, and had some points to take away from this video. When I first had the idea to put this together, I was shocked to see that there weren't that many videos on the topic. When I started doing some research into it and realized how hard it was to find figures and general arguments, I saw why that was the case. But when we set our mind to something and we're committed to make it happen, I feel like the goal should just be to make it as good as possible and provide as much value as you can. Don't forget to drop a like if you enjoyed this, leave a comment below if you have any insights or opinions on the topic, and if it's your first time here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button as we're coming out with new content every single week. Merry Christmas and happy festive season. We're just getting started here and there's a whole lot more to come. I'll see you next time.